It's 10 o'clock, so we'll make a start. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Delighted to see you all. Today, we're here to talk about the whole family approach to supporting children and families affected by alcohol and drugs. I'm delighted to say that this is the largest event that we've had so far. We had about 120 people signed up, which I think is a testament to the interest and the importance in this sort of work. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Rowan. I'm the project lead over at Corra Foundation. There's a number of Corra colleagues on the call as well today. I think the videos are off, but you'll see them in each of the discussion groups they'll be leading you through later on. We have a full agenda today with lots of speakers joining us. We've got Neil Hunter, who's the principal reporter from the Children's Reporter Administration. We've got Angela Gentili and Shona McPhail from Circle, and we have Stacey and Kirsty from Martha's Mammies over in Glasgow. We also have Diane Cairns, who's from Transform Forth Valley, who are going to talk us through some of the work that they're working on practically as well. You'll see we have a wee break, so a wee rest stop, and then plenty of time for questions and answers throughout the day. So I hope it should be a really interesting day for you. In terms of some housekeeping, if you could all change your name, if possible, so that it shows up your name and your organisation, that just helps us when we're looking to see who wants to speak to us during the question portion of the day. If you could also please remain muted throughout the conversations, that just means we can all hear a wee bit better. And when it comes to the point when we're asking questions, if you could just use the raise hand icon that you have on Zoom to be able to let us know that you'd like to ask something. Or you can also write your question in the chat if that's easier. There's also the opportunity, I think, in your settings to put this on speaker view so that you get a view of the person speaking rather than the whole collective of us, if that's something you prefer. Just to let you know, the session is being recorded so that other colleagues who can't make it today will be able to see it. If that's something you don't want to participate in, please use the chat function for any questions and feel free to keep your video off at all times. And if you have any problems, Maren and Matt are on hand to help you with the techie side of things, but hopefully everything should be smooth now that you're in with us and comfortable. So I think that's all the housekeeping issues to cover. So first off, I'm delighted to say that Neil Hunter from the Scottish Children's Reporter Administration is here to talk us through the whole family approach framework, which Neil chairs a group on for Scottish Government. So thanks for joining us, Neil. Really excited to hear what you're going to tell us about the group and its work.
Thanks very much, Rowan. Really great to be here and really great to see so many people join the call. One of the ambitions we've had and what we've been doing over 3 or 4 years now is to just try and increase the visibility of the need to work alongside families and support families much more comprehensively than we do at the moment, and to try and make sure that everyone understands across the substance use and childcare sector what we're trying to promote in terms of what a whole family approach means for Scotland, what family inclusive practice means for Scotland. And I wanted just to kind of touch this morning on some of those aspects. It's a really important learning event. I was really happy to be asked to be involved, because I think we need a series of learning events over the next period to gather up people's experience of trying to implement a whole family approach, and to think about what family inclusive practice means for them, for their service, for the people who we serve. And also to use those, continual process of feedback and learning and reflection to improve what we're doing. So, I mean, we're as a group are no means feel like we're at the end of the road. We did a piece of work over 2 years to develop the framework, and we very quickly moved into implementation mode in terms of supporting people and at local level in terms of whole family approach and family inclusive practice becoming a reality across Scotland. So yeah, really, really glad to be here. So the framework was launched in December 2021. And obviously we were developing and working through the framework in the course of the pandemic. But we came together as a group on a fairly regular basis to share thinking, to look at what they ask of us in terms of rights, respect and recovery around defining whole family approach, family inclusive practice, We built this work on the basis of a group who'd been meeting for a number of years, looking at children affected by parental substance use. We had been doing a lot of work very much focused on children in the context of families, but this is a real opportunity for us to widen out our thinking in terms of whole family approach. There are a couple of starting points in the framework, and I hope that they'll all be familiar to you. It's very much based on a strengths, assets-based foundation. Each person is unique. Each person has innate strengths and abilities. It's a very optimistic framework. It sees that change and improvement in people's quality of life as individuals and within families is possible with the right support and the right services and the right arrangements in place. But it sees each person as unique, the approaches that we need to take being very much bespoke and personalised. It talks about the right of people to expect help and support when they need it, and help and support to help them in the process of recovery, whatever that means for them as an individual. But importantly, it balances the needs and rights of families, of people, individuals in families, with an overarching imperative around the additional rights that children carry to be safe, to be nurtured, to thrive, and all of the really important language that we use about children, about having the best start in life, about Scotland being the best country for children to grow up, that we have a collective responsibility over and above supporting families to understand that children have additional rights, have additional needs, which we as a collective need to support. And that's really important for us, because whole family approach wasn't just aimed at services in the substance use sector, on the children's sector, but a collective responsibility for us to think about families, to think about individuals, and to think about, within that, to think about the needs of the particular children. We were very well aware when we were doing our work of the potential rubs and conflicts between supporting families and particularly focusing on children. But I think we've came to a real realisation and understanding that those conflicts don't necessarily exist. They exist when children's needs and children's rights are being put at risk, in terms of our task becomes more complex and more potentially more difficult. But the idea of supporting children in the context of families is one that's been with us for a long, long time in Scotland, and one I'm really glad that we're revisiting and putting more effort into and putting a lot more investment into. Our starting point also in the framework was that the services on the ground across Scotland need to redesign and reshape. We need to do that alongside people. We need to listen very carefully to people's experiences, to services up to this point, and listen very carefully about what their needs and aspirations and expectations are for the future. And that whole co-production and working alongside people isn't just in the design and in the design of services, but it's also in the delivery of services. The need to walk alongside people, be responsive to their ever-changing needs and issues and expectations and aspirations. And that's something that's really key in terms of how we expect services to work. We need services that are able to share power with people, that are able to be open. And we use the word democratic quite often because it's about participation, it's about listening to each other, it's about responding to each other, but it's also about making sure that we understand the power dynamic that has grown up in services over decades, and the need for us to be much more open to sharing decision making alongside people, to sharing power within services about how needs are met with people. I think all of you will know, or certainly have experienced, how, as we have over the years centralised services, decision making around treatment, around care, around recovery support can quite often be very much dominated by what services are able to provide, as opposed to what people really need. So whole family approach, family inclusive practice, is a real opportunity for us to shift the paradigm in terms of how we make decisions alongside people, with people, and in people's best interests. Fundamentally, whole family approach, family inclusive practice means that we have to work differently, we have to work more comprehensively together. We recognise that quite often people have to join the dots, bridge the gaps in their own endeavours to try and get help and support. We as a collective, we as paid service providers, need to do much better in terms of working together and not relying on people to be able to connect dots and bridge the gaps between our different services. And that sense of partnership, that sense of real collective engagement, a common vision, a common purpose is really important in terms of delivering whole family approach. And I hope some of you start to see that happening in your locality area, in your local partnerships, beginning to be much more upfront, much more open, much more invested in working alongside people who need access to services in terms of how they're shaped, how they're delivered, and how they respond to individual needs. And that responsivity needs to be part of our ongoing culture and our journey. Most of all, we spend a lot of time in whole family approach talking about the workforce, and we're talking primarily about the substance use workforce, but not exclusively. We're looking at the workforce in its totality. I think workforce and workforce development has been a really key theme in Scotland the last few years, and we've tackled it through some real high-level commitments around helping the workforce become more skilled and confident and competent, engaging with families, engaging with individuals and families, engaging with families as a collective, engaging with children and young people. So that whole skill set, that whole sense of competence, that whole sense of confidence, having to be in some ways rebuilt within our sector to some extent. Values, ethos, respect for people we serve, having the right exposure to learning opportunities, having direct opportunities to learn from people who've got lived experience and expertise. And that just, I think, a real re-energising of that whole workforce development learning framework for people. It's really important that we resource our workforce properly, that we invest in their learning, that learning comes from directly from people who have experience of services, who have experience of substance use, but also allows people to work and practice in a much more confident and competent way. And the final bit around resources, so the whole family approach, family inclusive practice framework comes with fairly significant resources over the duration of this Parliament as part of the wider National Drugs Mission. I think in total, over the period of the 5-year period of the Parliament, somewhere around £30 million being invested in whole family approach, family inclusive practice. And of course, we're hoping and expecting that some of that will also find matches at local level where that's possible to expand the impact. Next slide, please. One of the things I'm particularly keen to hear from people today is about how we try to define whole family approach, what do we mean by it, coordinated, holistic, focusing on individuals as well as the family as a whole, whatever that family looks like, or however that family is constituted. I think that's been one of the key things that we found that I've been working with the Partnership Drug Initiative for a number of years now, looking at some of the bids coming in for resources to develop whole family approach, family inclusive practice. One of the areas that people have kind of struggled most with is getting the balance between how do you provide a service that's focused on individuals and at the same time focused on the collective needs of the family, and how do you get that balance right? So I'm really keen to hear about how people have taken on that challenge. As I've talked about, a really positive, clear ethos of the possibility and of change and recovery for individuals. That's a really important starting point in terms of all of our services, in terms of that willingness to understand that people have real assets and strengths. Also focus on early support, not waiting to families precipitate are in a process of crisis. That real shift in terms of supporting families as early as possible and for as long as necessary. That's what Ask the Family, which we'll touch on later, talked about. On average, it's taken 8 to 10 years for families from the point of identifying difficulties to be able to access help when they need it. And that feels to us to be far too long. And that need to engage with families at a much earlier stage is one of the defining aspects of whole family approach. And of course, the nature of our services, open and welcoming, having really good values, having really good ethos, and being very inclusive and being very bespoke, personalised, individualised in our approach. Family inclusive practice, we're doing some further work at the moment, just in terms of further definition of what we mean by family inclusive practice and pushing that out and hopefully putting some learning and training opportunities around that. But running through that list of things, supportive families are assets. We need to build upon that. I spent many years working in the substance use sector, was trained to keep families out of the treatment, care and recovery process. Families can be assets, they can be real gains in terms of the recovery process and need to be very much included in that work. Families come in all sorts of different constitutions and all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And this notion of family inclusive practice must be really agile and responsive, and putting families at the heart of what we do and their experience at the heart of how we continue to improve services is key. The final bit there in terms of family inclusive practice, and again, colleagues may pick up on this later, trusting, respectful relationships focused on the financial stability of families. There's no question. I think everyone in this call understands that inequality, social and economic inequality, impact of poverty is so important in terms of the families who we have a real concern with and work for. But building on relationships and understanding family dynamics and giving people really seamless access to help at different points in their journey is all part of what we mean by family inclusive practice. The biggest thing I think we kind of considered was the longevity of support. And support, family inclusive practice cannot just be seen as episodic. It needs to be seen as relatively long-term, relatively open-ended, relatively guided by people's needs as they develop and evolve. Next slide. The framework talks about some priority themes. Wanted just to pick out particularly, obviously, when we're talking about families, we're talking about different families, different constitutions, different shapes and sizes of families and configurations. But you can't really talk about families without really tackling the issue of stigma and the barriers faced by women. And so the framework talks in our design of whole family approach and family inclusive practice services. Need to be really mindful of the particular issues faced by women, particularly women involved in abusive and exploitative relationships. We have a really clear understanding of the barriers in terms of accessing services, particularly where children are involved, and the need to make our services much more open, much more welcoming, much more focused on reducing and tackling stigma. The recent 2021 Child Protection Guidance for Scotland makes it very clear that our child protection work, our work in terms of protecting children, is working alongside families, and some of that real recognition that those barriers have been created by decades of practice that create fear and anxiety amongst women in particular around approaching services for help, and we've got to really tackle that in terms of our redesign. When necessary, we need to provide really safe, gender-specific services, and the services we provide in those being flexible and responsive to individual needs. So the real focus on the particular theme of providing much more effective, much more open, much more welcoming, much more inclusive and rights-respecting services for women. It has to be a cornerstone of our whole family approach. And I've kind of touched on this already, but the workforce, we keep coming back to the workforce, which is all of us, confident, skilled, trauma-informed, able to give really meaningful, empathic support to people, that balance of the needs of individuals with the needs of the whole family group, and just getting our thinking straight on that, getting our practice framework straight, and getting our understanding of those dynamics and potential rubs really straight. And the other area of priority theme, and this is something we've taken all the way through to ADPs and Children's Services Partnership, planning partnerships, is we want to see much more vibrant, sustainable, long-term relationships between statutory and voluntary sector services, working in partnership, investing together. The third and voluntary sector has unique skills and attributes that make it incredibly well placed to deliver on a whole family approach, family inclusive practice, and doing so on behalf of the collective partners that have a real interest in children, young people and families, and that's been so important, and we will continue to track the degree to which those partnerships and that collective approach is in place across the country. Next slide, thanks. But more on the workforce. I'll not repeat it too much, but sometimes you can't repeat that too often. Respectful, inclusive, really coming from a rights-based understanding, the rights of children, that with the wider human rights that should steer our services. We're doing a lot of work as part of the wider drugs mission in terms of the national collaborative around putting a human rights perspective at the core of how we deliver services. And that is about making sure that people's rights are understood and they can be delivered upon, and that they are at the centre of what we do. And that whole power shift between services and people is part of that human rights approach. We have to understand that families in all shapes and sizes and all configurations have real core value and are not to be excluded and sidelined, but to be at the heart of what we're trying to do around whole family approach and family inclusive practice. And as part of the work that we picked up from the independent care review and the promise is a return to, I think, what people desperately want to get back to, which is relationship-based practice, relational approaches to how we work with people. I've been around this field long enough to see the change in services in the 1990s, when services became focused on assessment and care management. And it was transactional, and it was driven by forums, and it was driven by professional assessment done on someone, which led to, or sometimes often did not lead to, a care plan or a menu of services. And I think we've suffered for that, and I see now the re-emergence of a real commitment to relational-based approaches to working with individuals, relationship-based practice, working with people in a really individual, bespoke, personalised way, responsive listening, providing the kind of help and assistance that meets their needs and aspirations and expectations, as opposed to a process-driven transactional approach. We've got to put that history behind us and move on. And you can't read the document without really understand, without really getting a sense that that's where we want to go. That sense of active helping, learning from experience, that continual feeding back from people's experience of the support and services that we're able to provide. The openness, the approachability, the welcome, the real focus on reducing and negating stigma, and that sense of being open to people's thinking and ideas in terms of how we shape and deliver our services. Thank you. Thanks for Clyde. Thanks. So, having done all that work, I think we're now at the stage of trying to do what we call a kind of bit of a gap analysis. This is our aspiration. This is what we want to try and achieve in Scotland. Where do we think we're at in terms of the current situation? So it won't surprise you that we've seen in this kind of gap assessment work a lack of consistency across the country. We're a small country. We're a diverse country. We do need divergence in terms of how we provide services, because our partnerships got different shapes. Our rurality and our geography is different, and we have real challenges. But the lack of consistency in what's available to individuals and families across Scotland is not where we want it to be. We need much more divergence in terms of what people can reasonably expect. Where we have legislative powers, and this particularly was in relation to the Children and Young People's Act, the 2014 Act, which kind of embedded GIRFET within it, where we have powers to provide services to families, to children and young people, they're not always used to the full extent. And some of that's about resources, but some of that's about lack of understanding of what powers to do certain things with families and provide certain services are not fully understood. We kind of had a real sense of the cultural change. We're still very much in progress on that, and we need to shift that whole power imbalance between people who provide services and people who use services. It's a very constant touch point for us. There is good practice in Scotland, and I think we hear a lot about that today. Good practice in Scotland and best practice does exist, but it's not consistently everywhere. It's not embedded everywhere, and part of the framework is about trying to, over a number of years, embed that across Scotland. And this is long-term, open-ended, sustainable services that we feel that families want and need are not always available. We know directly from Ask the Family that that's what they said. Services, support cannot be episodic and time limited. It needs to be long-term. And that, of course, is a real resource challenge, but it's one that we have to be absolutely mindful of as we go through the next couple of phases. and just scaling up services and making sure that where we have joint working, we can continue to invest in that joint working. Substance use doesn't exist on its own. It exists in the context of income for household income, housing, employment opportunities. Exist in the context of giving children opportunities, making sure that children have early years education opportunities. So it absolutely completely makes the point about partnership and local joint work. Next slide, please. What we said has to happen over the next 3 to 5 years is strong partnerships, local leadership, working alongside families, making sure that the investment in new resources is visible. We are tracking the money that is being released across Scotland to make sure it's getting to where it has been determined it needs to get to. We're very well aware that quite often new investment coming out goes into filling some of the gaps that already happen local level. And I can understand the dynamic on that. I worked in local authorities for long enough to know that that happens, but we're really, really determined that new resource, new investment will go to developing or improving existing services for families and auditing that really carefully. The framework has said we need to see co-production be much more part of our everyday design and delivery of services. Joining up funding stream, we've got the whole family wellbeing fund being delivered at a local level in support of the promise. More generally, we've got the whole family approach, family inclusive practice funding. The obvious thing that we'd expect to do is to see some of that funding join up to best effect at local level. We recognise that bits of money come out in different parts of government, and to some extent that's inevitable. What we want is some of that being joined up at local level in terms of service development and investment. And the final bit is about working and learning together, learning from people who use our services, learning about incremental, continual improvement of our services, but learning as a workforce around family inclusive practice, whole family approaches, making it a really core, strong ethos in what we do, and continuing to adapt and change. I mean, we've set this framework a couple of years ago. In a number of years down the line, I expect us to be able to adapt and change based on some of the conversations we might have this morning about how people are finding delivery of the framework in reality and in practice. And I think that may be my last slide, but there may be one more. Yes, there we are. Questions. So I hope that was helpful. That's where we've got to in terms of the framework. It is a framework. It's not rules. It's not regulations. It's something that we hope people will professionally, intellectually be able to engage with and think about how their service or their partnership or their local development programme can be shaped and influenced by some of the thinking we've done. So really, really keen to hear your questions or comments or anything like that.
Thank you so much, Neil. That was a really interesting summation of a lot of many years of work. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it was lovely to hear about the importance of or how it was based and the ideas of working together and being a collective. So that was really lovely to hear. Thank you so much. So yeah, now it's over to you, colleagues. Any questions that you have for Neil or comments, we would love to hear them. Please just put your hand up, your electronic hand that is, or use the chat function, and Matt will be able to get you on screen to speak.
I can see someone has their hand up, just trying to, it's Maureen. So Maureen, if you'd like to go for it.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say, Neil, I actually feel slightly emotional because it was just so hopeful what you were sharing there. I think it's obviously what a lot of us in the third sector have been hoping for in terms of that sort of shift in landscape for a long, long time. I mean, I think we've still got a long way to go. For those of us on the call who've been working in the third sector for a long time, it's still very hard to secure funding for a long period of time to really bed in local areas. And it's also quite a challenge to persuade funders and commissioners of the need for longer term supports and that kind of flexibility of support you're talking about, where people can recover and be doing well, but then maybe need a wee bit of pop-up of help without needing the full kind of boona of support again. So I think having that agility and flexibility is really an aspiration we're a wee bit away from. But just overall, just wanted to say how hopeful and optimistic that's left me feeling. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Maureen. I really appreciate your comments. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad there's a sense of optimism. I mean, we're not naive in the group, and so we know there's loads of financial pressures around NHS boards and local authorities. But we also firmly believe one of the ways, if we're ever going to get to, in Scotland, that a preventative approach to working with families and children and young people, the role of the third and voluntary sector is absolutely critical, and the investment required, the long-term sustainable investment required to shift the balance. And that if we continue to funnel money simply into statutory services, with what we know, because I mean, I've worked in statutory services for as long as I can remember, and the tendency is to funnel things up, and to when we've got when resources become really tight, the thresholds go up. And in Scotland, we know that's a really dangerous place, particularly for children and for families, as the thresholds are raised. And unless we grasp the nettle around investment in local community-based preventative services, we're going to continue just to see those thresholds go up and up and up, and families and children and young people being left, more or less unsupported, other than through local initiative. And I'm involved in a number of local charities in Glasgow, and I know the complexity of just trying to keep going every day, multiple funding streams, and the whole situation, particularly now, is just really so difficult to sustain. So we're not naive about the actuality on the ground, but we're absolutely determined that this much more equal partnership between statutory and voluntary sector partners is utterly critical to the future of Scotland's, of a desire to see much more earlier intervention and prevention of the Christie principles. Essentially require a really strong, sustained third and voluntary sector. There's no other way about it. So again, we're really trying to find a way through that, encourage ADPs and their constituent bodies to really follow that kind of pathway in terms of investment in the third and voluntary sector, and not just that, but have equality of arms in terms of genuine partnership.
Thanks, Neil. And we've got hands up from Diane, followed by Michael. So Diane, if you want to go for it.
Hey, hi, Neil. Thanks very much. That was a great start to the proceedings today, and we love the document in East Ayrshire. In East Ayrshire, we're having a whole family wellbeing conversation at the end of September. So it's like a conversation cafe. This will be one of our first times we're getting young people's services and adult services together. So my question to you is, when I have all these people in the room, what question do you think that I should ask them as a collective?
I think my question would be, where do families fit in your planning and priorities? How are you currently meeting the needs of families as well as individuals? So again, this is a real at the heart of whole family approach, the ability to work with individuals in their own right, but at the same time can reshape ourselves to be able to work with families as a collective. So that would be my question: is where the families currently fit in your priority? And I suppose as follow-up, I was able to ask two questions. How skilled do you feel your workforce is in working with and engaging and supporting families? But I also would like to say it's exactly that kind of listening event that we need to encourage, and people sitting down respectfully, the sense of mutual ambition, listening to each other, and coming and getting all the issues out on the table, but gradually starting to tick off the issues so we get to that much more a sense of common, unified way forward. So I really hope the event goes well.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Great. And we have Michael up next, followed by David Barr.
Yep, hi Neil, thanks very much for a really comprehensive, as has been said, and optimistic presentation of the whole framework, and there wasn't really any surprises of what we're aiming for in best practice, and you did mention there is the constraints of the funding constraints, but we all do our best with those. I'm calling from a service that you once visited in a previous lifetime with when you were at Glasgow Addiction Services, and that it was actually devastating that you moved post at that point. We thought we were actually going to get some money from Glasgow, and we've still not received a penny. But that's another aside. Just wanted to share a wee bit about our how we've worked historically as when parents with substance abuse that can come for rehabilitation, often at assessment stage are pleading to get their family back and children back, and we emphasise that our approach is to give the child a responsible parent back, and it's not. No truths are black and white. There's most of them are grey, and there's different for each individual the ways of working with that overarching guideline is different for everybody. But we have a family support group that has been running for the last 21 years. So all family members of all service users are open to attend that in the local town hall. So we've always tried our best, but we've got some of what was mentioned in your presentation. We've got a lot of room for progress in that, but as we're still constrained by. Well, we're only still alive thanks to Corra. We nearly closed 3 times because local authorities not giving us money, but I'll not get political in that. But I really want to thank you for your approach and look forward to trying to work alongside others collaboratively to put the framework into to embed it, not just locally but nationally, because we serve the whole nation. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And yeah, I mean, I think huge respect to you for over the years, the Jericho House, and keeping going. And yeah, it's just really disappointing that my own previous and other local authorities haven't been able to step up and support services like your own. So, but I think it's just huge respect to you and the rest of the team for the resilience you've shown over the years. I think one of the point you make about parents going back to some kind of rehabilitation or consistent contact with children is a really important one. I worked in this field a long time, as have you. I've rarely met a parent who doesn't want to provide a loving, safe relationship for their child. Substance use can get in the road at times of that. And but our starting point always, I think, has to be that in 99% of occasions, people who are experiencing substance use issues in their lives want to be the best parents they can possibly be. And we need to, and sometimes our starting point has to be in a continuum, but we must never lose hope. And I think, in a sense of sometimes despair, our child protection systems, of which I'm now part, can sometimes lead to that sense of despair that contact is reduced forever, or adoption of permanent proceedings are taking place. And the legal system, I want the legal system now, has to make sure that if those decisions are made, they're made with really objective best interest of the child at its heart. And that is one of the areas of real conflict. But I think we're getting to a place, and I certainly work with my colleague children's reporters every day, where there is a sense of trying to just make sure that we've given every opportunity for the rehabilitation of parents and their children, where it's in that child and families, but that predominantly that child's best interest to do so. The promise, I think, really is very crystal clear about the need to be resilient and to have long-term stamina with families, because children ultimately are where they can be safe and loved and secure. We need to find ways of ensuring children remain within their family, even where there perhaps been periods of separation. It's a really important kind of tenet. There are always be circumstances where that can happen, but we need to be really clear about why and the legal basis for that. But yeah, huge respect to you and the team, Michael.
Can I just say that a lot of the work that we do is for parents is to look at the generational dysfunction, and until that's understood, the chain can't be broken when it's the dysfunction has been multi-generational, and there's nobody came our direction that if they've not got childhood trauma, they've got trauma from their active addiction, and it's really important that those underlying causes and conditions are treated for the individual before they go back into the full parenting role. That's been a definite part of our experience.
Yeah, it's a really, really great insight. Thanks, Michael.
Great, and back over to you, Rowan, to introduce the next speakers.
Great, thanks so much, Neil. That was just a really fascinating insight, and gauging by the chat, everyone's feeling motivated and maybe even emotional by some of the things you were speaking about. So that's always a good indication of the commitment that there is to this work. So thank you so much. I think you're going to be around for a wee bit, Neil. So
yeah, I am. Yep.
Great. So I know we had to skip over some folks' questions. I'm really sorry because of time, but hopefully maybe we can build in a wee opportunity at some point if there's any slack in the day. But thank you so much for joining us today, Neil. That was really interesting, and thanks to everyone for your questions and comments.
Thank you.
Okie dokie. Next up, we've got Angela and Shona from Circle, who are going to talk us through their project that they are working on as part of the National Drugs Mission Fund. And thanks for coming along, Angela and Shona. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rowan. I'm Angela Gentile. I'm a project manager in Circle over in East Lothian. I just want to say good morning to everybody, and equally, I'm very hopeful. I sat on a group with Neil many years and colleagues, and we've got some brilliant leaders in Scotland all the way through, from ground level all the way through different kind of disciplines, and I am extremely optimistic. I think it's a really good time for families, actually. So I have a kind of ever-expanding team, which is fantastic, but I would really welcome my colleague to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Shona McPhail. I'm the Family Peer Support Worker at Circle, and I've been in post since November last year.
I'll briefly say thanks to our funders. As Neil mentioned, the join up really between the national funding and the local funding. We're really fortunate to be in a position to have both, and I do really appreciate the long-term funding. First time in my career in the third sector to have 5-year funding. Also in statutory, actually, in terms of those important relationships with families. So we've got a real thanks to our funders just on the slide there. Move to the next slide, please. We're going to talk today about who we are, what we do. We're going to listen to some lived experience. So we've got a father's film, which is Stephen. And at the end, we've got a young person's film, which is Lewis, which was taken a few years ago. We've got a few key bits of research in Circle. So we did a knowledge exchange with Edinburgh University around about 3 years ago. And that's available on our website. We've done a test of change called Conversations for Change, which I'd encourage people to look at. Particularly for those kind of open-ended questions, and any tools that you want to use from our website, you're very welcome to, and just phone us or email us, we're happy to help. And then we've also got a local evaluation. So I'm giving you some information really from all of those aspects of our work, as well as our practice day to day. So what does Circle do? We work alongside the families to offer practical, emotional parenting, connecting, and advocacy support over the longer term and on an outreach basis. What allows us to do this is a protected caseload. So that's really important kind of going forward for commissioners as well. So that is kind of high value in the sense of being able to reach those families, stay with those families through crisis, reach every individual member in the family as they define their families. We work in a rights-based way, and we operate on an asset-based model, looking at people's strengths, identifying their strengths, their interests, finding various different ways to engage. We bring together family values, and at the heart of that is the best interest of the child. We look at developing skills and their individual skills, as well as skills within families, so communication, organizational skills, budgeting skills. We help facilitate solutions alongside the families, which means we're kind of going with our definition of the problem, and that's particularly important. As I look at in another slide, we look at the difference between the referring problem and the actual challenges that families face. We co-produce family support plans, and we do that over time. And each individual family member may have a different view of the same problem, so obviously that becomes complex. And we try to enable each individual family member to share their views. We develop individual and relationship-based as well as family goals. So we look at dyads within the family, like parent-child. And we also use accredited programs like Parents Under Pressure, Raising Children with Confidence. We often refer to the Alcohol Focus Scotland tools, Signs of Safety, and Safe Them Together, just to name a few. Really love our colleagues in Scottish Families Affected by Drugs, and we often I find myself quoting some of their work and different tools that we'll look at later on as well. Our referrals come from a range of sources. That includes the majority from social work. And obviously we'd like to get to the point where we prevent that kind of crisis and the duty calls so that we can reach families earlier, and we're slowly but surely doing that. We receive referrals from drug and alcohol services, from our health colleagues and the third sector, as well as self-referrals and word of mouth. So this is who we are. When I first started 3 or 4 years ago, there was 4 of us, and we've expanded to a team of 12. We've got a couple of different partnerships taking place where we prevent homelessness with Cyrilians, and have a whole family support mediation post that works in tandem to offer mediation as well as whole family support alongside the prevention duty. It's coming into force. We have our pregnancy workers, that's the earliest possible time to reach families. And we've got a couple of family outreach workers who work with families where there's children affected by parental substance use. We are working with Scottish Families Affected by Drugs just to become an early adopter site very recently as part of the Grow Your Own Roots partnership. Shona will talk about her work, and that's a lived experience post, which we're delighted to have. And we also have 2 children's resilience workers that work with 8 to 12-year-olds who specifically felt kind of left out, and as if they their circumstances were very, very different to their other peers, and they felt quite isolated and specifically requested to meet others like them, as well as be offered one-to-ones. We're going to have the next slide, please. So a number of years ago, we looked at what the whole family approach is, what our definitions should look like, as well as what was out there in terms of the literature. Really now fortunate to have a rapid review of the literature published by Scottish Government, but I would definitely recommend citing Morris et al., who identify across the different services that there are around about 3 categories. Category 1 was families that were seen as the basis for support for individuals within the family, and a focus on their ability to support that family member. And this is true of parenting services where the child is the primary service user and improvement of children's outcomes is the main focus. So you could arguably, a lot of our services have that focus. Category 2 is services that are developed according to specific and independent needs of family members to maintain or enhance support to service user and develop family strengths. Individual family members can be seen to be service users in their own right, and their needs can be addressed in isolation of the service user. And then category 3 is whole family approaches are seen to offer opportunities to focus on shared needs, develop strengths, and address risk factors that cannot be dealt with through a focus on family members as individuals. Shared needs can be hard to define, and this definition may lend itself more to improvement in family functioning as an end and processes that support families as a whole, rather than direct engagement with individual family members. I think we're a combination of 2 and 3. Just to make life a bit more complex for ourselves, we do work between individuals, dyads, and whole families. Anybody who does group work will have an excellent range of skills to help with facilitation. And if we can try and imagine families as groups who operate in an ecology with varying different levels of resources, that's probably the best analogy that I've had to be able to kind of conceptualize, really. Through the research, we also found that families usually offer the first source of support. Whole family approaches are interchangeably used for parenting support. There are gendered assumptions around parenting. They're predicated on situated relationships of care. We often work with a lot of young people who can be described as young carers. They don't always want to adopt that definition themselves. There are siloed approaches to service provision. In my opinion, and also backed up a bit by the research, they're rarely wholly ecological. Distress in families is visible, and there is a vested interest in locating blame in terms of complex problems that are rooted in inequalities and intersectionalities in the family. And I think historically, some policy has travelled in that direction, and we really welcome this focus on the strengths and the asset-based approach towards families that the new framework allows us to have. It's absolutely essential. And we talk about buoyancy within families and elasticity and that ability to bounce back. Move on to the next slide, please. So we've got a 3 or 4 minute film from Stephen just now, and he is a dad who's received support from our service. So we, after having met with family members as well as team members, we as an organisation came up with our practice principles, and I'll attempt to rattle through these because I appreciate the time's vanishing rapidly. So we obviously are strengths-based, we work with the whole family. We're solution-focused, so we place the family member as the expert on their own situation. That's particularly important. That's not something that's new, that's something that's been kicking around for a very long time. We see the whole person, and quite often the parent tells us it's the first time that they've been seen as a person and an individual by a family support service as opposed to just a parent. We work across systems in family life, so the individual, dyads, the family, wider community, school, work, activities, community groups, as well as wider society. We operate based on ethics of care, which is about fairness, about respect, about what's called solidarity in the literature, which for us is going the extra mile, which is particularly important to families. We know that regardless of family size, social capital within families improves children's well-being. So we try to reduce social isolation, improve confidence, chum people to appointments, be able to get them involved in local activities, and so that they can stand on their own 2 feet eventually. We want to always positively include fathers. So that's really important. At some point, I'll be applying to a funder for a father's worker, because we do have these across Circle, an absolute desperate one for our own team. It's invaluable work, but we all work with fathers, of course. Could move on to the next slide. We know that families have a range of problems, so we asked families at the beginning of their referral to the service what they thought their challenges were. That's a really open-ended question. Also, what the solutions are is an even better question in some ways. But what their challenges were very different to what the referring problem was, which is in blue on this chart. The family's definition of problem is in orange, and our Circle's assessments in grey. So families themselves actually felt that benefits and debt and housing and living conditions, when put together, that's about halfway along these bars in the bar chart, so where it says 19 and 12, they're put together, that's the #1 challenge for families. So it really does reinforce the belief that actually it's the economic, health and social inequalities that exist for these families that impact upon distress within families. Second challenge for families was mother's health, which was largely mental health. And you'll notice that at the point of referral, father's health is a 0. That's not identified at all, but is a very important kind of focus of our whole family work. Referrers, on the other hand, saw children's emotions or behaviour as their referring problem, and then looked to families to resolve that. Families and Circle felt that social isolation and family activities in the community was also quite important, but referrers did not kind of place quite as much weight on that. And some of that is about resources and some of it's about confidence. We know that domestic abuse is quite low here because it's at the point of referral, but actually across the caseload it is highly prevalent. So again, we look at Safe and Together as a model to underpin our practice there. And there's probably loads that I could say about this slide, but we'll move on. I could say that the range of problems is important to acknowledge. It's not something that can be solved by a siloed approach. And at the end of 9 months follow-up, 43% of problems had been completely resolved, and all families made some progress. I think it was 40% had resolved the majority as well. So these are the main barriers to accessing support. So lack of awareness of right to support, so the rights-based approach is essential. The complexity of the problems that families face, stigma, as Neil said earlier, anything that addresses stigma helps families. Fear of child protection, fear of judgment, which is why we played Stephen, because he really says that very eloquently, that non-judgmental approach is super important. There's various references across embedded in the links as well, so feel free to go to those. Move to the next slide. So what's important to families is someone to talk to and taking their time to build up that trust and relationship. They prefer a straightforward conversation and people who are straightforward, so they don't have to read intentions too much and read between the lines too much. They prefer someone who's genuine and not judgy, there through the ups and downs, doesn't give up. Somebody who's thought about the children and comes kind of prepared for that conversation with parents if children are there as well. Somebody who goes above and beyond, and that is a trusted person out with the family is super helpful because that's an additional layer of kind of reflection. Somebody that's consistent and reliable. And it's quite simple things like learning to be kind of face-to-face with their children, or learning to regulate emotions before having conversations. And also, particularly in relation to child protection, if we ever have to kind of make that call, people feel supported within it and they feel that we will help them have a voice within that process, help them build on their strengths, and ultimately allay fears that actually everybody wants families to stay together. Move on, please. I'm going to hand you over to Shona, who talks about what families like about the wider support.
Thanks, Angela. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk quickly about what families have told us about what the whole family approach feels like for them, and also talk through a few examples of methods that we use to work with the whole family. So a few months ago, I took families through a conversation through the National Collaborative about what services felt like for them. And about what kind of circles of support feels like for them, and all of these things are the things that families said. So it just kind of speaks to how working in a whole family approach feels like for the family. So the first thing that they identified was that it feels really flexible. It was important for families that our support was responsive to their needs at the time. So there's times where families only needed a half an hour check-in and we could provide that on the phone or going to visit them, but that also in times of crisis, we could offer a sort of longer session for them. The support felt very available. We were there to kind of answer calls and to make appointments kind of when people were available. They said that it felt very persistent, that we understood the nature of mental health and substance use issues, and didn't have a sort of 3 strikes policy, but really tried genuinely hard to engage with families, because that was the nature of substance use. They spoke really highly about peer support, about how working alongside someone who had experienced it themselves is really valuable, and that they felt there was a sort of non-judgmental aspect about peer support, which they really liked. They also talked about how it felt collaborative. We make a point of co-producing support plans with families and with individuals in a sort of parenting programme that I'll talk about later. We kind of are very sort of working alongside the families, and that we talk about what modules we're going to work on. The families get to choose. It's a very flexible programme, and just very down to earth about the actual support that we provide people. They really liked that we do work with the whole family, because as we know, substance use doesn't just affect an individual, it does affect the whole family, and it works in a whole family system. So it kind of makes sense to address the whole family issues. They said it also felt that we worked in the communities, and that we were aware of the problems that were arising in communities, and that we knew the local area, and kind of put context to the problems that families experienced. So we knew about the problems that were happening in schools and education, and different things that were happening in the communities, which affected the families, which then made a difference to the kind of support that we could offer them. And lastly, they said it felt very individualistic. They recognised that every family's problems are different, and that the support therefore needed to reflect that, and gave them a real sense of what can help families. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are kind of practical methods that we use to work with families. And one of the things that I'm trained in is called CRAFT. I'm sure some of you know about it. It is community reinforcement and family training. So CRAFT trains family members to help their family member get into services, but also improves family relationships and the well-being of the family member. It takes place over 6 sessions, and one of the sessions looks at teaching families how to have better communication and positive communication. And the things that you see on the slide here are the points that we take families through in structuring a positive conversation. So we speak about being brief, being specific, being positive, about labelling your feelings, about offering an understanding statement, taking partial responsibility, and offering to help. And we find that this really helps families improve communication and family relationships. So that's a kind of an important one. And you kind of tend to find that once they kind of know the structure, that they can then use it with different conversations. We kind of suggest that they start with something quite small and get a bit of practice around smaller issues, something as simple as talking about emptying the dishwasher or taking a glass to the sink, just kind of normal family problems, and then they can kind of build up to talking about the bigger issues. Next slide, please. So I'm actually just going to brush past this slide. This is a case study that was done with our pregnancy outreach support worker, and kind of talks about the challenges that are faced, circles interventions and positive outcomes. But if anyone wants to have a proper read of that, they can have a look at the slides after. Next slide, please. So one of the really important bits of work that we do with families is a parenting programme called Parents Under Pressure. Again, some of you might be aware of it. I'll just sort of explain it quickly, but the diagram that you can see on screen is a kind of snapshot of where a child is at with their well-being at any moment. So the dotted line that you can see in the middle of the screen is where a child's at, and all the other things are what can impact a child and a family. So the blue and the yellow are the things that directly impact a child's well-being. So things like family warmth, love and nurture, keeping your child safe, parenting knowledge, hopes and dreams about your child and routines. And then in the pink circle, there are things that impact those 2 things. So that's the parent's ability to manage their emotion, the child's ability to manage their emotion, and how well the family are at solving their problems. And then impacting on those things, in the outer orange circle that you can see, is the connection to family, the connection to culture, and the connection to community. And impacting on these things are the real world problems and the community resources. So the way that PUP works is you would do an assessment on all of these areas and work out where the family strengths are and where the areas for improvement are. And then there's modules that you can take families through from there. So some of the modules are things like view of self as parent, connecting with your child to help them feel loved and safe, a health check for your child, and one that comes up quite a lot, especially in families who struggle with substance use, is managing emotions under pressure, and sort of helping families with emotion regulation and increasing mindfulness. Next slide, please. So these things are some of the ways that our children's resilience worker works with children. So these are emotion cards that she'll use with children and families to kind of help encourage children to talk about their emotions and their feelings, and just get into a habit of being aware of their feelings. Anyone who works with children will know that children love slime, and we use this as a tool to kind of help children get tactile and get creative. Also provides quite a good distraction while the worker might try and talk about some other things, more serious things. We also use painting to help the child get creative and try and encourage the children to get out in the fresh air as much as possible, and engage in some exercise and kick football about, and again provides a good opportunity where there's no eye contact but you can still be talking about some important issues. Next slide, please. So this is a video that was done with our worker Bob and a child that he worked with for about 3 years called Lewis, and Lewis talks about the support that he received from Circle. So hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much for playing that. So Sharon and I really struggled to think about what we would squeeze into 20 minutes. So the important and wise words of Lewis there, we will end on. We couldn't say any of that better than him and Stephen. We hope to get more of these from various different family members. So thank you for bearing with us. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll of course take questions.
Thank you so much, Angela and Shona. What a really interesting presentation, and Stephen and Lewis's videos were just incredibly powerful, so please pass on our thanks to them as well. What a wise wee fella Lewis is, talking the way he did there. So thank you so much, Angela and Shona again. We are running very behind now, I'm afraid, so I'm going to suggest a little amendment to the agenda, if you don't mind. I've asked Stacey and Kirsty, and kindly they've agreed to present after the break, so I'm going to suggest that we take a quick 5 minutes now, if that's okay, just a wee break to get us back on track, if that's okay. So if we could come back at, say, 25 past, that would be really helpful, and at that point we'll move on to Stacey and Kirsty and then Diane after that, so we just have to reshuffle a wee bit to get us back on track. But thank you so much to Neil and Angela and Shona for presenting in the morning, all really, really interesting. So please enjoy a wee break, and we'll see you at 25 past. Stacey and Kirsty, who are from Martha's Mammies, a project over in Glasgow. Hi there, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you've had a nice little break. I am on the iPad, so I can't get access to the remote, so I'm just going to let you know when I need the slides changed, if that's all right.
Yep, that'll be great, thank you.
Perfect. So just happy for you to put the first slide up. So my name's Stacey McCleary, I'm the team leader based here at Martha's Mammies. Also on call with me today is Kirsty Davidson, who's the family group decision making coordinator. She's going to come in a wee bit halfway through the presentation to kind of share her views and her journey so far. Go to the next slide if that's all right. So for anybody that's not heard of Martha's Mammies, we are a service that's based in Glasgow that works with women who have lost care of their children through care proceedings. I really like to think about us as that kind of really adaptive, sticky outreach wraparound service for women that is led by the needs and wants of the women at where they are in their own journey. We have in-reach services, sexual and mental health, as well as advocacy support. Lots of group work happens down here as well, where women get the opportunity to build a network of peer support with women who are going through similar or have went through similar things with them. We really try and support women to have their place in the world that isn't met with judgment about circumstances that led to the removal of their child, or the decisions that are made that the child are no longer returned back. Really early on in the planning of Martha's Mammies, it was really focusing on co-production and about being guided by the experiences of women who have went through this process and the experiences of women in terms of how services have been delivered in the past. We had reached out to the Alcohol and Drug Partnership in Glasgow and had the opportunity to meet the lived and living experience women who have had experience of children being removed from their care, children returned, or long-term decisions about care being made. And I think it was a very humbling experiences for the people who partook in the sharing of those events, for the staff that were employed by Glasgow. I think one of the things that came out so clearly was just the experience of the loss of their child and how in society as a whole it's such a taboo subject. As workers, we've all really, over the past kind of 11 months, 12 months, had the chance to really reflect on that and reflect on what women are telling us about their experiences of loss. At one point, we had done a loss and grief training. It was just through crews and it was more of a kind of information sharing event. But what really struck for me was women who have lost care of their children aren't treated the same way they would be treated if they lose their child through death, per se. When you lose somebody through death, you become bereaved. So there's a socially accepted term in which people refer to you, and there's an etiquette in terms of how people treat you. Our women don't have that. When they lose the care of their child, they carry so much of a burden in terms of shame and blame and guilt, and they have nowhere to express that. And I think if we think about this from a whole family's approach, we're really thinking about the needs of these women and being trauma informed in terms of how we support them. Often when children are removed, the care planning turns to be about finding long-term placement for that child or continuing the care of the child, and often women and families are forgotten or ignored in terms of that care processing and care planning. The women at that time, often it can be really high risk of self-harm, suicide, overdose, or the significant emotional impact it can have on them. Our service is really designed to think about and be responsive to women's experiences and think about creating an environment that does not re-traumatise them or leave them at any kind of increased risk. We took a lot of learning from the women's experiences, and what we often do is have focus groups with the women. We meet with them individually to find out from their perspective what they think is going really well right now in terms of Martha's Mammies and where they think we can do things better. And let me just tell you, these women are quite happy to tell us where we need to do better. Quite early on, they were very clear that there was a real barrier for them accessing sexual health support. So we partnered up with the Sandyford Clinic, which is a sexual health clinic in Glasgow. And from that, they do an in-reach service here. We are now the most well-attended sexual health clinic for women in Glasgow. So again, listening to the needs and wants of the women and progressing that through, what they want, and listening to the individual feedback that they have. We really strive for our service to be trauma-informed and our workforce to be really trauma-responsive. So one of the things that we heard from the women who'd experienced the loss of their children was just how much trauma is carried from the buildings of where their children's allocated social worker works, or where they've had those really difficult meetings in which the long-term care of their children, you know, it was agreed that rehabilitation was not an option, or where they've had really difficult contact with their children. So something that was took on board from us straight away was that we had to be separate from the social work building. So we absolutely are. We are in a completely separate building to any other social work service. If you ever had the chance to come and visit, it's very home-like here in terms of it's one big corridor, but there's a shower room, there is a big comfy living room, there is a dining room, there's a kitchen, tumble dryer, washing machine. We really want women to be able to come here and access our service and access a space and a place to meet other women and have all other needs kind of met and kind of basic needs met. Next slide, sorry. I've obviously did a wee kind of whistle stop tour of what Martha's Mammies is, but where we really wanted to focus the conversation today is a really innovative component of Martha's Mammies. And that's our commitment to family group decision making and lifelong links for women who are affected by the isolation of the loss of their child. For anybody who doesn't know what family group decision making is and lifelong links, I'm just going to talk about it just ever so quickly. Family group decision making is a model of practice in which it's family-led. It's a family-led decision making process, and it really recognises the strengths of a family, and it wants to empower them to help them develop a plan to protect and support children and the family. Lifelong Links came about by a family rights group initially aimed at supporting children and young people to reconnect with family or other important people in their life, reducing isolation, creating supports, and hopefully they would last throughout the life of the child. Now, what both these models have, and they're very similar, is this kind of ethos, and I think it resonates so strongly with the whole family approach in that it's strength-based, solution-orientated, family-focused and blame-free. But really at the core of it is that they're recognising that the women or the children or the family are actually experts in their own life. Family group decision making and lifelong links is really well established within Glasgow's children's services. Branching into Martha's Mammies is really the first time it's been talked about in terms of an adult setting in Glasgow, and it's a really opportunity for us to explore how the principles of family group decision making and lifelong links can help women in terms of recovery and be reparative towards relationships that might have broken down over time for them. Right at the start, when we were planning for Martha's Mammies and thinking about what it would look like, and again taking in what the women had told us in terms of their experiences of isolation, their experiences of care planning through children and families that resulted in them relationships between them and other people breaking down, was we were really thinking about this service about being a kind of mediation, kind of reparative service for women, trying to rebuild networks of support, repair relationships that might have been damaged through women's choices in terms of addiction or mental health or other personal needs. We were really hoping for this to identify members in extended family or friendship groups that could develop a plan or a shared understanding of how to mobilise and reduce isolation for that woman. We obviously had put funding into Corra and were successful, and we do have a half-post family group decision-making coordinator, Kirsty, who you'll meet really, really soon. In terms of cases right now, there is 60 cases who are open to Martha's Mammies right now, and that's 60 women accessing the service, and right now Kirsty has 10% of those cases on her caseload, and she's offering support. I kind of feel as if this is where we need to do the expectations versus reality and really reflect on, you know, that's what the hope was about how we were bringing family group decision making and lifelong links into Martha's Mammies. But I'm going to kind of pass you over now to Kirsty in terms to reflect about how this journey's gone so far. I think for me, it is really just about thinking about the ethos of the workforce being really adaptive to change and be flexible. And I hope Kirsty's going to be able to kind of share more with you now.
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, so I think Stacey's kind of went into a wee bit of detail there just about how we initially thought it might look. So looking at it from a lifelong links perspective, which is the majority of the work I'm doing, I'm trained in both family group decision making and lifelong links, but primarily within this role it's about lifelong links for these women. And thinking specifically about that approach, it's a kind of model of practice that you follow. So when we kind of started, typically my role is about supporting those women to identify people that are important to them, whether that's in their past or in their present, and helping build on their social connections and their networks. And as Stacey said, a lot of that work isn't just with the woman herself, but within the links that she identifies. So doing some of that restorative work and that mediation work where there is a lot of fractured relationships. And that is a bit of what I'm doing just now, but the reality is it's much more complex for these women, and it's not just a straight line from where we begin to where we end in terms of trying to achieve those links for them. And the reality is it wasn't always possible, and sometimes the relationships were either too fractured for the women, they weren't in a position at that point, didn't feel they had the strength or they were in the right time in their life to approach those relationships, or from their perspective, they couldn't identify positive links for them. So in the traditional model, that would kind of be where my relationship would end with them. But what we kind of seen here was an opportunity to develop the role where I could potentially undertake some direct work with these women aimed at building their knowledge and their understanding and their relationships and the resilience within relationships. So we started to think about themes that I might be able to do some work with the women around. And when I first started working with the women, we kind of set an area of focus that they want to look at and they want to achieve. And some of the themes that came from that was relationships, understandably, but not thinking about their friendship groups, thinking about their family and some of those fractured relationships, their partners, but also potentially the family time that they might have with their children. So thinking about those relationships and what they mean to them just now, and what they can do to improve those relationships for themselves. But also doing some work around thinking about what healthy and unhealthy relationships look like. Though a lot of the women were quite keen to explore some of that because they recognise that historically a lot of the relationship haven't been positive. We've also been exploring things around life journey, and the process of lifelong links, I suppose, does that naturally a bit anyway, because we're asking people to think about significant times in their life where they've had positive links. But thinking about their life journey goes into a bit more detail for these women, and it really gives them an opportunity to map their experience from their perspective, which many of them haven't done before. And I think the areas where I've started to do that with women, we're finding it really powerful. The other area that I look at as well is kind of wellness and well-being. So where we think about building a women's resilience on their own and with their relationships as well. So thinking about that self-care, thinking about boundaries and how to set those boundaries for themselves as well. So whilst technically that wasn't our primary aim, and our primary aim is to kind of restore their family relationships and identify positive links for them, we recognise that the nature of work we do, it has to be really flexible and adaptable and responsive to what the women actually need. And what we've kind of started to realise is that by doing some of those pieces of direct work with the women, that we're helping them to be able to identify future positive links in the future and develop the skills that will allow them to go into relationships hopefully in the future with a more kind of positive perspective. One of the other things we looked at as well was in terms of communicating with adults. So when I was in children and families, we did a lot of work around direct work with children, and I found that it was equally important in this case. As I started to do the direct work with the women, I realised that perhaps the scope within my role might be a little limited, but the scope within the team and the skills within the team could really be utilised so that we're doing this type of work with the women on a more regular basis. and helping them think about kind of creative ways, using activities and using direct work to help the women explore some of these themes. And I think that's going to be a really important part of the service that we deliver, because it's not just about giving them the opportunity to speak about their experiences, which is really important, but it's also about helping them develop and reflect on some of the themes and work through that. So we're hoping that as we develop some of those resources, that will be a good asset to the team as well. But I suppose the biggest takeaway from Lifelong Links that I think we can try and express to the women is that it's at their pace, that it is very much led by them, and that kind of feeds into kind of think everything we've been talking about kind of today in terms of partnering with them. My job is to partner with them in order to help them reach their goals and to connect them to more positive links in their lives. But it has to be at their pace, and they have to understand that it's a voluntary and supportive service for them. Can I have the next slide, please? So, challenges. I think what we've kind of realised is that in terms of the women's experiences, they have experienced multi-layers of trauma. They have got really complex and at times chaotic lifestyles, and they are at times additional barriers for us when I'm trying to do this work with the women. So it's really important for me to try and work compassionately with them, to help them navigate some of these additional barriers whilst they're undertaking the work, and be really patient with them, because it's not just the work that they're doing with me, but it's all the other things that are going on for them at the same time. So that takes it back to it must be at their pace. In terms of timescales, we recognise that the nature of the work that we do, there's not clear timescales. It's not a short piece of work that I'm doing, but it's really flexible and adaptable in terms of what that particular woman needs. So it's very difficult to put a clear timescale on it. And it's not something that I particularly want to do, because I think it has to be person-centred and kind of needs-led in that sense. So I think we've recognised that. I think we've also recognised that it's also not always about the outcome. So when we think about lifelong links and following that particular process, it's not necessarily about have we achieved a certain number of additional links for this woman, have we got to a family meeting successfully with these links. These are important things, but also it's important for us to recognise the journey perhaps that woman's got on. So even if we've not came to the end at a meeting, we've still recognised that through doing those significant pieces of work, actually they're really, really important for that woman's own development and her own journey, and just to make sure we put value on that as well. The data, in terms of the data, we're still kind of exploring the best way to capture that. I suppose just what I said before, we do recognise it's important to think about some stats in terms of have we increased our network, have we had family meetings, thinking about the number of significant pieces of work perhaps that have been done, but we're also looking at kind of discussions with the women in questionnaires and ways of getting feedback directly from them that capture the women's experience. How do they see a difference in their life? Can they notice a difference from when they first started to the end in terms of their self-esteem, their relationships, and kind of the main areas in their life? So I think it's also really important that we capture some of that rich data as well. So the last little bit here says, can women do both children, families, family group decision making, and Martha's Mammies family group decision making? We kind of look at this because we work very closely with our partners in children, families, and we need to kind of recognise that if both processes are running together, there might be some complications in that in terms of us making sure that we're putting the services around the women, but the wider family plan might be having to take into account the child and other factors. So we've not kind of came across a scenario yet where the two of them are happening at the same time, but what we're kind of doing is we're working closely with others to kind of chat regularly about the women we're working with to make sure there's not There's just good communication, there's not any overlap, and probably doing that from the beginning, so where there's a referral into children and families and they know they're already working with us, making sure that we're there at the initial stages to have those discussions at the beginning, to make sure that, you know, both processes are able to run at the same time, and also we're not overwhelming the women with all the things we're asking her to do. Next slide, please. So this last bit is really just an impact story. One of the women, I had a wee think about it, and I thought it'd be good to tell you about one of the women I was working with at Martha's Mammies. So kind of how it works is her support worker refers into me when she felt that she could do with some support, specifically around lifelong links. Her situation is that her child was up for adoption. She wasn't having any contact with her. She had some ongoing addiction issues, but was stable at the point of referral, and she was in a relationship where domestic abuse was a contributing factor. I kind of recognised the opportunity to work with this woman and working through some of the issues that she's going to experience in terms of the adoption process, and also recognising it's a crucial time to help her feel connected. So in the first couple of sessions with the women, we agreed that one of the things we'd do would be a life storybook. That would be for her daughter. So by completing that book and giving it to her daughter, she knows that her daughter has that understanding of her sense of history and identity of where she came from. It also, by doing that, therapeutically helped that mum work through some of her own journey that she'd went on. And then naturally from that, she was able to identify that there was a previous foster carer that actually looked after a child for a year, and how supportive they were, and how she really valued the support that they'd offered her. So with her agreement, I was able to get in touch with the foster carer via social work. I was able to track them down and speak with them, and they were really keen to be a link for her. I'm really pleased to hear about her. We spoke about the challenges in the previous page, and I suppose it's important to recognise at this point the additional barriers kicked in for this woman. She kind of relapsed, and through some conversations with her, what we kind of realised is that she was finding it really difficult around some of the shame and the guilt that she was experiencing, because the last time she's seen that foster carer, she had a child returned to her, and now she's having to face on the situation she's in where her child's getting adopted. And that was obviously really significant and difficult for her. So what we agreed was we would pause the work, and we would give her a bit of space, and then I'm helping her kind of work through some of those feelings and emotions, and letting her dictate the pace we go at, so that when she's feeling comfortable and ready, we can revisit that positive link for her. So whilst it's perhaps not progressing like we would have liked, it is a real positive for this woman, and there's some hopes for some real connections for her, which we take away at the moment as a big positive. So next slide, please. There we are. So I'm just going to hand back over to Stacey.
So thank you so much, Kirsty. You know, we are only about 9 months into our journey when it comes to thinking about family group decision making and lifelong links and how that's going to work for Martha's Mammies. And I think there has been really significant progress made. But what we continue to have is a real commitment to always listening to the women and the women who are accessing the service, and really adapting how that's working for them. Always thinking about training and upskilling staff and making sure they've got access to the right tools and the right training to make sure that they're able to complete the task with the women in a way that won't re-traumatise them. I think one of the things for me is every piece of work that Kirsty's undertaken with each of the women who've had access to it is so bespoke for them, and really centred around what they need and taking into consideration their individual needs in terms of their individual learning needs, their individual needs in terms of where the work takes place. And I think continuing on that flexible approach to developing the role of the coordinator and really thinking about, you know, her approach being bespoke, I think that's really one of our focuses for the future. Kirsty kind of touched on it, just about considering the crossover for children and families and Martha's Mammies in terms of family group decision making, we are really keen to consider that, and just really thinking about where we're making plans for children, we need to think about the wider family and plans around them and making sure that they've got the proper support. And I think it really resonates much with what Neil said right at the start, where it's about planning for a family, but individual people within that family have their own care plan. One of the things that work really, really well for Martha's Mammies is just the kind of in-reach services. So women who are coming in to meet their worker, or women who are coming in for other group work, that there's an in-reach service available to them at the same time, so they're not duplicating how many times they're coming down to the centre. You know, they're utilising the centre as much as they physically can while they're in the one place. So Kirsty really is considering making a kind of drop-in service in and around when things are already happening, you know, trying to capture women when they are ready and able, because sometimes I think offering appointments, women can build themselves up, and then something happens and they're not able to kind of follow through in it. So these are really, you know, I think we're taking a lot of learning from the outcomes of the promise, and even thinking about things that are coming out through the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, where there's a lot of experience of people about things being done to them from services, and we're really trying to kind of combat that and make sure we're being led by the services of the women. I know we've got questions and stuff coming up a wee bit later, but that's all from me and Kirsty.
Well, thank you so much, Stacey and Kirsty. That was really interesting and so lovely to hear about the compassion that bases everything you do, and also naming that disenfranchised grief that women are feeling. So thank you so much for sharing those stories and things that you've learned as you go along. So yeah, there'll be time for questions after the next presentation. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Diane up to speak. Diane's the service manager at Transform Forth Valley, who's going to talk us through some of the learning from her projects. Hi Diane, thanks for joining us.
Hi, just check that I've got this right, yeah. Hi, firstly, I need to say that I'm dog sitting, so hopefully we'll have no barking, so I pray no one comes to my door. So apologies in advance if they do. So hi, I'm Diane Cairns. I'm the service manager for Children and Family Service within Transform Forth Valley. So that's the Time for Us service. So Transform Forth Valley is a small charity who respond to identified need across Forth Valley via a wide range of services which support individuals and families who've been impacted by substance use and or societal, financial or health inequalities. So I have no presentation today. I'm here just to have a chat and a whistle-stop tour of what we do at Time for Us. So Time for Us was developed about 15 years ago, where we involved children and families in the design and delivery way back then of the service. So the service name was decided by the families, the logo, where we meet people, how the session would be undertaken, that we don't wear uniform. So even way back then, they recognised all the stigma and things that was going on for them. So all these things are not static. We have developed them and tweaked them over the years, again, with the young people, children and families involved in that. And we, every time we discharge an individual, we get extensive feedback from all stakeholders involved, so that we know that we're doing the best we possibly can by the children and families that we are working with. So we work with children and young people impacted by a significant family member's drug and or alcohol use, which is a recognised adverse childhood experience, so one of the ACEs. We also directly work one-to-one with adults who are stable in their recovery and who have care and contact with their children. But what we also do is provide holistic family assessment. So that's not new to us, though we've always done this. So when people started talking about whole family approach and what we were supposed to be doing, we were thinking, well, that is what we're doing. But like everything, you can make things better. And it's about other services dovetailing into all of that. That makes it actually more holistic in the process. So as I said, we've been around for 15 years, doing what we think we do best, that specialist intervention with children, young people and families. And I think that it's the reason that we've always included the family and did that assessment is because If you think about working with a child or a young person in isolation, well, that's never going to work. It would make no sense that we're helping them make sense of their world, but their world's not really changing. So what the assessment does is it allows us to access the adults and everyone in the family and allow us to decide who's the most regulated adult in that setting. And then that way they can support the child or young person with the work that we'll undertake with them. Where we're working with adults, we get a referral in for an adult who is stable in their recovery and maybe want more contact with their children, or have contact with the children, but they're maybe struggling a wee bit with their parent and stuff. So we do a lot of work around that, but we do that with the families as a whole anyway, regardless of who the referral comes in for. We know that individuals can develop alcohol and drug problems as a result of their own childhood adversities and unresolved traumas, and through no fault of their own. So as a specialist service, we understand the impact that this has on families, so we ensure that all those affected get the support that they need until things get better, and to help them reach their full potential, which is basically adhering to the GIRFEC principles. We also recognise that those experiencing problematic substance use issues are often carrying other burdens such as poverty, inequality, and health challenges, which we've all heard about already this morning. This means that they need to be supported rather than stigmatised. We therefore, where appropriate, signpost into treatment services, as we know that quick access is crucial, as that in itself is a protective element. And by addressing the inequalities and tackling child poverty, we help children and young people and prevent them from becoming parents in poverty in the future. Therefore, the service has a positive impact on breaking intergenerational cycles of adversity and trauma. We also know people with drug and alcohol issues face stigma and discrimination on a daily basis, not helped by the media, who like to use all sorts of derogatory comments when speaking about people with drug and alcohol dependencies. And that's a cultural issue that really needs to change, but obviously it's going to take time, because I know that over the years, I've been in this role for 9 years and we're still banging the same drum and challenging and doing what we can. So stigma still remains a significant barrier to people getting the help that they need, as we've already heard this morning. I think Neil was the one that raised that as well. We therefore work hard to challenge that. As I said, we empower our families, ensuring each person is in control. So what that means is we'll co-create child plans, family plans with the children, young people and adults. And that ensures the plans reflect the authentic voice of each individual, just as we heard Lewis's authentic voice today, which was so powerful. So that also allows there to be buy-in and ownership, which is so important and is at the core of what we do. The plans cover societal, social, emotional health needs. Anything that is raised as a barrier to anything, we will address that where we can, or pass on to the specialist who can address it. We're not precious because we believe that it's about getting the right service to help people at the right time. So we know where our specialist skills lie, but we think it's really important that people recognise where they don't lie and pass on to the people who know best. We also support transitions to new services. So this reduces the need for them to retell their story. So reduces the likelihood of re-traumatisation and also helps break down many barriers. It just makes it so much easier if there's someone there that they trust and can rely on who's introducing them to that new service. As a service, we diligently communicate across many professional boundaries, and the purpose of that is to achieve the best outcomes possible. So we recognise the rights of people, their families, their communities, and how it's essential to treat people with respect, dignity and compassion, which is so important. It actually costs nothing, but it actually makes such a difference in a person's life, which leads to all individuals being fully supported within their own unique recovery journey. We therefore provide a relational, strength-based, person-centred and trauma-informed approach so that we can build on what people are good at. And by building on people's that asset approach, that allows them to build on their confidence and self-esteem, and ultimately their resilience and their self-efficacy, which is what our whole aim is. We also take a rights-based approach. A children family service, our foundation is built on the UNCRC, ensuring that human rights of the people using our services are protected, promoted and supported. This is actually also embedded in our culture within our service. We also have protected caseloads, like Angela mentioned. This allows us to work with individuals for a long period of time, as is necessary. So we work with children one-to-one in schools where they're attending. A lot of our young people don't attend education, so we work with them in the community. That's usually a place of their choice where they feel comfortable and what suits them. Again, that's about meeting their needs. It's about, the focus is them, not about, oh, I don't really like sitting in the health centre or sitting here or sitting there. It's about what the young person wants to do, where they feel comfortable, because what ultimately you're actually hoping for is for them to open up and be able to speak to you in a comfortable, relaxed manner, to tell you their deepest, darkest secrets and thoughts, as Lewis said as well. So that takes a bit of time. What I will say is, within the team, they're very quick and very good at building relationships, positive relationships really quickly. And I think that's because we empower people, we listen to people, we put them at the centre, and we value what they say. And as already been said today, some people will say that's the first time they've ever felt heard. And that's just really, really sad. But that sadly is a situation at times. Within Time for Us, we also have an early intervention service where we receive Police Scotland Vulnerable Person Database concern reports with the VPDs, and that same holistic approach is taken. So no matter what way the young person or child or family comes to us, we will undertake the same assessment processes regardless. The early intervention service actually uncovers hidden harm and unmet need, allowing us to signpost to people to get the right help as soon as possible, and a lot sooner than has previously been the case. I think when you hear, like Neil saying, that the point that it takes on average 8 years for a family to get the help they need, that is just absolutely awful. Absolutely awful. This early intervention service was really born out of sheer frustration as well, as I was alarmed to be continually reading children and young people's chronologies where there was multiple missed opportunities for intervention, which would have reduced their adversities and experiences, and also supported the adults within that family setting to get the right support much, much sooner. So we're still actually having to work really hard at that across the whole systems. Our early intervention is making a difference, but again, the gaps we know today are due to competence, the responding and the triaging of through, whether it be any workforce that's involved in that process before we get it. So it's about understanding that we're looking for that really low level, first time coming to the attention, and actually pass it to us, because that's that early intervention and prevention that we really need, not when they've come into social work or through the police VPD system multiple times and then it becomes a crisis situation. So that's taken a bit of time to get off the ground. We've been working hard at that since August 2020. So I would say that in the last year we've started to see it picking up. So that's just about, as Neil also mentioned earlier, about skilling up the workforce and getting the message out there and making sure people are aware of what it is that you do. So our services work within the values and principles of recovery-orientated systems of care as well, where we want people to be self-directed. We want people to be individualised and have person-centred care plans and everything, that they are the centre of what we do. So we empower them, it's holistic, it's non-linear, so we don't actually, stick to a rigid plan. It's flexible, it can be anything that the individual wants it to be within reason. But we want to have that strengths-based, peer support's really important as well, and we work hard to make sure that we link families into that peer support and recovery community. And respect is so at the heart of everything. that a lot of our families will tell us have never felt respected. We believe there's still a lot of work to be done, and we only still receive a low level of referrals from adult services, sadly. Our main referrer is children and family social work, but anyone can refer to us. But we're still learning and we're still developing. As I say, every day is a school day, and we learn most from our children, young people and families, because they're the ones with that lived and living experience. And that's what's really important, that we hear those voices, because that's what's going to make the difference. We already see there is a trajectory here that's actually making a difference, but it's still got a long way to go. We were successful in our bid to Corra this year and received the funding to have 2 extra staff, which they're currently just started a few weeks ago, and they're in their induction phase. This will support our wait times and the significant increase in referrals that we've seen since COVID. I think that it was about 235% increase we'd noted. But what we're also noting is the complexity around the referral, what's actually there, a lot of neurodiverse issues. And I'm quite sure many of you are seeing the same type of thing. So there's a lot still to be done. There's a lot of work, but we're working really hard trying to do what we do best, linking with other services. Some services over the years, we've seen many services go that were absolutely amazing. And again, that all comes back down to funding, which we also find difficult, without going into the detail of that. That's for another day. But yeah, so I just wanted to say, thanks very much for listening today. I hope that it lets you see that some of us are trying really hard within third sector. And I think that I've noted a huge difference in statutory provision actually listening more to us. And I would say that's been since COVID, because we were the eyes and ears for many during that period of time. So yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Diane. That was really interesting and incredible to hear you talking about the respect that families feel from your service in a way that they haven't before, and wonderful to hear that you've got maybe a more open door with statutory services than you have been before. So that's wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much.
Most definitely we have. Yes, definitely.
Thanks so much, Diane. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes for questions for the panels and speakers today. So that's Diane, Stacey and Kirsty, Angela and Shona, and Neil as well, sorry, if you don't mind putting your cameras on, and we'll open the floor to questions. Now, I think we're going to prioritise the 2 that we weren't able to get to, Neil, if that's okay. So I believe one was David Barr. If you're still on the line, feel free. If you remember your question, that's putting you on the spot now from earlier this morning.
No, not at all, Rowan, actually, thank you. In fact, Diane, I really enjoyed what you had to say there, and you rekindled my question for me. Something you said, I think, captured it really quite well. You talked about how long you've been doing this, and you talked about the impact of the media and the need for culture change, and I really felt for you when you said we've been banging this old drum for 9 years. And there was a bit of an inference that we're just not seeing the level of change that we'd like to see. And that was pretty much what came to mind for me after Neil had spoken. And actually, when you think of all the presentations, which have been fantastic, so thanks to everyone, and I think a particular thanks to Lewis. I think he's got a wee place in my heart now from earlier. So there's a great deal of work going on. We can see that there are lots of people in this group, and no doubt much wider than this group, doing the right things at the right time and offering that support when it's needed. But we're probably all feeling a collective frustration that despite that, just as you put so eloquently, Diane, we're not seeing the system shifting change in culture and in practice that we would like to see. It's not happening as quickly as we would like. And I don't think that's just impatience. I think we would all say we want something bigger to happen. We want it to happen a bit more quickly. So my question to Neil was going to be, and I suppose it's a general question now, how do we take all the love and positive energy and experience and knowledge in this group today and work more effectively in a collective and collaborative way to achieve greater pace in that system shifting change that's needed, that change in culture, that change in practice, and yes, maybe even changing our media, or however impossible that seems sometimes. But how do we work more effectively together, both at a regional and a national level, to push things forward and achieve the kind of big changes that we know are going to take away some of that frustration that we feel from only reaching those people that we can reach? How can we try and make sure everyone gets access to exactly the same kind of approach that we've been talking about this morning?
Yeah, it's a really big question, David. I suppose from the inputs we've just heard from colleagues, I suppose it kind of makes me feel really happy. Firstly, that we slowly but surely we're seeing, there's such compassion and empathy and warmth and care in some of the services we've heard from this morning. It's absolutely obvious. I don't think those examples will always be in the minority. The big challenge for the promise gave us all, and again, there's the same frustration about the pace of change. How do we get to where we all want to be quicker? About services at a human scale, of a human nature, with a core of empathy and understanding, and that understanding comes from a kind of intellectual understanding of social inequality, economic inequality, adversity, and trauma. And I think the whole narrative around adversity and trauma is the key to unlocking this. Because I think it reminds me of when I was a young worker in an alcohol and drug service. Someone first put up the kind of Prochaska de Clemente trans-theoretical model of change. It's one of those learning points in your life that once you've learned it, you can't unlearn it. And an understanding of trauma and adversity and its impact on the people who we exist to serve is one of those professional learning points where once it clicks in your head, it's impossible to unlearn it, and that you see the world in a completely different way. So there's a whole bit about we need to continue with the learning and consciousness raising across the whole workforce around trauma, adversity, and its impact on social and economic inequality, and all of the things that drive the difficulties that people face day to day in their life. This is not willful, feckless behaviour. This is a generational experience of social inequality and adversity and trauma, and we have a collective responsibility to help people overcome that. So I think we just need to keep going with that, however frustrating the pace is. I suppose the second thing is we need to target it, and I think we need to target it. I think when I go and speak to NHS chief executives or local authority chief executives or chief social work officers, I think they really get it. I think they really understand it. There's a bit in the middle. I think we need to target this at middle managers and middle leaders across our organisations, the kind of almost the meat and the sandwich, who I think want to work in a different way. There's something getting in the way. We've got to understand what that is. I think others don't necessarily get it yet. Some might never get it, in which case we've got to reshape our leadership and our workforce because they're getting in the road of culture change. I think if colleagues know the promise were on the call today, I don't know if they are or not, they might share the same feeling. Is that middle tier of people who are kind of stuck, but who are leading our services. So I'm like everyone else here, now long in the tooth, but I feel as optimistic today as I've ever felt that we will continue to. And part of the framework for me is this comes with the political support of the administration. And of course, we know that there's been all sorts of different difficulties in relationship between national government and local government. Very House agreement, really boring, bureaucratic, but actually it's trying to reset that relationship, and that this is national policy, and how are we going to deliver it locally, and how are we going to show the leadership and make sure the resources flow to support all that. So there's all sorts of different connotations, but an absolutely brilliant question. I don't know, on a Thursday morning in the middle of September in 2023, I still feel like the fight is there to be won, David, and I hope you feel the same.
Agreed, Neil. A big conversation to be continued. I think we can agree, but lots of great points there. It would be good to explore them all in more detail in another day, another another setting. Yep, thanks.
And I have to agree with what you said, Neil, there, that actually until we have trauma-informed services throughout and communities and people understand it, bottom up, top down, then we'll just have to keep banging the drum, because I do see a shift, albeit not as fast as you'd like, but there's still that positive shift which we have to hold on to.
Thanks, Diane. Now, time is very much against us, so I'm going to suggest if you have any questions, please stick them in the chat, and either you can exchange details with the speakers, or maybe they can answer them there and then. So I maybe got time for one more. So Peter, you've been sitting patiently since this morning, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rowan. Thanks everybody for your presentations. I'm quite familiar with the work of Transform, particularly because I operate in the same area. And also the other services like Circle and Martha's Mammies. I'm quite fortunate because I get to work alongside Corra and kind of review some of these things. And I suppose I'm kind of thinking about, when we're speaking about the trauma-informed approach, now I'm somebody that came through services, so I very much understand how they don't work. So it's good to see the kind of way that third sector organisations are working to address the shortcomings. I spent a long time in drug treatment services and I watched them fail repeatedly. So I suppose when we're looking at the trauma-informed approach, right, I find it very interesting because it's a word I never heard for a long time. And I suppose this is more a reflection for Neil, but everybody's kind of talking about delivering a trauma-informed approach, right? But what I think is missing is where it's being delivered, because we're delivering it to services, we're delivering it to workers, but when we're speaking about early interventions, we're not delivering it to the people who are impacted by it. And that to me seems absolutely bizarre that that's not happening. Because if you're delivering it to people who are impacted by it, they've got a greater understanding of it, they're going to be less traumatized by that impact on them, and they're going to feel probably a bit more normalized. So it just, to me, it's absolutely incomprehensible and inconceivable that we're taking it. It's almost like the services are reacting more to the problems within services than the problems with people. And I find that very, very strange that happens. And that kind of leads to other issues that we're kind of speaking about, talking about transactional things as well. Do you know what? I'm actually going to stop there, because I could go on and on and on and on about some of the things that were touched when we're talking about transactional elements of service delivery, because there are services that won't deliver match models of care around people on mental health medications and so on and so forth, and there's no proper kind of psychological interventions with people for people using substances, and that's concerning. But not to be too negative, I mean, there's a lot of really, really valuable information. So if you could maybe reflect on that trauma-informed delivery, Neil, or anybody else, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
It's a really, really great question, and I think, Peter, we're working on an assumption, and I think it's an assumption we need to test, that if we are able to really embed a trauma-informed, trauma-competent set of practice and principles and values in the workforce, that cascades through to how they deliver services to people. Now, I'm quite open to be challenged about the efficacy of that, but there's no doubt that we need a workforce, not just in the substance use, but across the board, who are able to discuss